Hello everyone, Inhuman Form here. Today I wanted to talk to you about psychological warfare and propaganda. Since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there has been an explosion of information on the internet coming from all sides of the war. Social commentary, maps, and urban legends have appeared on the screens of viewers from across the globe, proving to the world that social media has become a part of the battlefield. However, since the brutality and violence of war itself elicits so much emotion in viewers, it can easily be used to mislead them into ignoring a commonly employed weapon during times of war, the powerful concept of psychological warfare. An important part of understanding this is knowledge of how and why it developed. If you're new here, remember to hit subscribe and let's jump into this topic.
But there is another very important phase of warfare. It has as its target not the body, but the mind of the enemy.
Psychological warfare in its most successful form is the inability of those being targeted to defend themselves against the effects of psychological manipulation during war. Psychological warfare aims at the insecurities and desires of its targets and uses these as a means of achieving objectives.
For psychological warfare and its media of expression are dynamic, always learning surer ways of breaking the spirit of the enemy.
In the front line, Psy-war works against the enemy's morale to make him suspicious of his officers.
Throughout history, philosophers and military theorists have written about the physical aspects of war in great detail. Many of these philosophers have also been concerned with the political, economic, and psychological components of war. Chinese military general and philosopher Sun Tzu spoke of the 5 fundamentals to the art of war, which are of vital importance. These included the weather and terrain of the battlefield, as well as the methods and level of discipline in one's military force. Constant awareness of these 5 fundamental factors, or the absence of awareness, could be the determining factor in life or death.
Although they may escape injury, many will show varying degrees of non-effectiveness. This will be due to the emotional impact of being exposed to massive physical destruction and great personal danger.
One of the most important tenets of Sun Tzu's philosophy was the idea that all warfare is based on deception. This powerful idea laid down the precepts of psychological and guerrilla warfare in which a clever aggressor could defeat a larger and stronger target through the use of propaganda.
I'm Colonel Foster. I'm going to be your guide for a short tour through the maze of communist propaganda. Maybe you'll begin to believe some of it. Maybe you'll begin to wonder if there isn't some truth in it. Maybe nobody really likes us. Maybe the world really thinks we're imperialistic warmongers. Maybe.
Throughout this video, you will see that Sun Tzu's advice is still followed today by guerrilla fighters, politicians, and even businessmen and women in order to gain an advantage in the corporate world. An early example of psychological warfare can be seen in Persian immortal guards. The name comes from the fact that no immortal ever appeared to have died, because they would remove the dead from the battlefield whether the battle was won or lost, and their enemies never truly saw a dead immortal. According to ancient historians such as Herodotus, they've been said at times to wear a thin mask over their face, which gave them a faceless, menacing look that contributed to their deathless reputation. Modern psychological warfare has been known by many other names, including psychological operations, political warfare, and even propaganda. Historically, it had largely been disparaged and scorned until the 20th century, when it became a fixture of the state of war. At the outbreak of World War I, British newspaper publisher Alfred Harmsworth gained strong political influence because of his use of a new form of journalism that directed its focus towards the working classes. His primary goal was to galvanize British public opinion in support of total war. He did this by publishing sensational stories containing simple good versus evil narratives and anti-German sentiment which heightened tensions in Europe. As World War I erupted, President of the United States Woodrow Wilson, following in the footsteps of the British papers, started one of the earliest examples of government-funded propaganda, an agency called the Committee on Public Information, otherwise known as the Creel Committee. The committee used every medium available to shape public opinion in favor of America's participation in the war. The American population, who had originally reflected a strong desire to stay out of the war, were bombarded by newsprint, colorful posters, and radio programs, all broadcasting the committee's pro-war message. Journalists and other news sources who were against the war were buried by the volume of news put out by the committee, successfully stomping out any opposition. The Americans had changed from a peace-minded people into a militant and warmongering population eager to fight within 6 months of the committee's existence.
The propaganda efforts of the Committee on Public Information, a very Orwellian name, did succeed in driving a pacifist population into raving anti-German fanatics, to the point where the Boston Symphony Orchestra couldn't play Beethoven, things like that.
Emerging from the Creel Committee was an American business consultant named Edward Bernays, who would alter the world of psychological warfare, propaganda, and advertising to such a degree that his methods are still used today. After the end of World War I, Bernays had realized that the concept of propaganda was scrutinized heavily by the public, but he saw it as a tool that had many uses. Observing how effective it was in shaping the psychology of the masses, Bernays rebranded the term propaganda into public relations in order to avoid scrutiny, and started a public relations firm. The firm became known for its legendary campaigns, which boosted the business of major corporations by causing changes in public opinion. Bernays was also related to pioneering psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, who was his uncle. This relationship gave Bernays' work a veneer of scientific respectability. He provided political leaders, corporations, and media outlets with the means to control and regiment the masses without their awareness. To do so, he told them it was necessary to appeal not to the rational part of the mind, but the unconscious. And they could do this by using impulsive desires as a tool to manipulate the masses.
But Bernays' particular influence was exactly as you say, and he was one of the founders of the modern public relations industry, which grew into a massive industry right at that period. Had it existed before, but it became very important after at this time, and its goal was to control attitudes, beliefs, to marginalize people, to induce, to drive them towards what were called the superficial things of life, like fashionable consumption, and keep them out of the public arena where they don't belong.
Bernays was successful in turning average citizens into mindless consumers of material goods and media, but he failed to see the destructive potential in his methods until they fell into the hands of a totalitarian force that was emerging in Germany in the 1930s. Minister of Propaganda for the Third Reich, Joseph Goebbels, was an admirer of Bernays and his work. Leading up to and during the war, Goebbels pushed Bernays' ideas to their fullest extent, creating a cult of personality around Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime through the use of propaganda, resulting in some of the most destructive and murderous crimes in human history. Under the control of the Nazi Party, a new information environment began to evolve. Experimental new forms of propaganda emerged, overpowering the German population with messages designed to influence their beliefs about German nationalistic ideals and how they viewed the world outside of Germany. During the first weeks of 1933, the Nazi regime deployed the radio, press, and newsreels to stoke fears of a pending communist uprising, then channeled popular anxieties into political measures that eradicated civil liberties and democracy. By the end of the decade, in September of 1939, the German army under Adolf Hitler launched an invasion of Poland that would mark the beginning of World War II. To justify the action and mislead the public, Nazi propagandists accused Poland of persecuting ethnic Germans living in Poland.
But there's another force applied in combat that we generally don't think of as a weapon of war. That weapon is words. Yes, in a situation like this, words are weapons.
Psychological warfare was not a new concept by World War II, but was certainly the first time psychology was weaponized to such a degree. Propaganda techniques were used to wear down enemy forces, as well as raising morale in one's own military force and on the home front. Prior to the war, most aspects of social psychology were philosophical, and the discipline was simply viewed as philosophy of the mind. But during World War II, governments began enlisting psychologists for psychometric testing and psychological operations, giving rise to a systematic field of research that tested how certain actions would affect human behaviors.
What is it in your mind when you couldn't talk? What is it that stopped it? Something came through there and stopped it. What is it now? Think quickly. Think deeply. Let's go back. When was it you lost your speech? You had your trouble talking. Go back quickly.
What were you doing when the planes came over? I was in a hole. You know where you are? I think I'm in the States now. They told me I was coming back, but they told me I was going to die.
Psychological warfare campaigns altered enemy perceptions by deliberately distorting military significance, by exploiting ethnic and political differences between populations, and by systematically increasing the stresses of war through the use of propaganda. In many ways, these campaigns displayed the power of language.
And it works in many different ways. The printed word and the spoken word.
One of the simplest yet most powerful tools in the arsenal of psychological warfare was the letter bomb, a form of airborne propaganda where military aircraft would deploy non-explosive containers which opened in mid-air, dispersing tens of thousands of paper flyers called leaflets containing simple messages, attempting to alter the behavior of combatants and non-combatants in enemy-controlled territory.
As a weapon of psychological warfare, the leaflet is invaluable. The leaflet is far more permanent than the spoken word, for it can be read and reread.
The leaflets had illustrated messages that would prey on psychological effects that would haunt soldiers during extended periods of combat. These included factors like hunger, loneliness, and cold temperatures. Some common examples of illustrations on leaflets depicted an unfaithful spouse back home, or a warm, home-cooked meal encouraging military personnel to desert combat. By exploiting these psychological factors, leaflet propaganda attempted to focus on suffering rather than death. Leaflets were unquestionably effective during the war, but military psychologists noticed two problems that emerged. Military psychiatrist James A.C. Brown was quoted saying, "Propaganda is successful only when directed at those who are willing to listen, absorb the information, and if possible, act on it. And this happens only when the other side is in a condition of lowered morale and is already losing the campaign." The second issue that arose from the messages on leaflets was a failure to understand how the target audience best receives information. Leaflet propaganda had to be planned with great attention to the variables of the situation at hand, including the culture, language, and the history of the target audience, which in turn affects the attitudes and behavior elicited from the message. For example, when attempts to persuade Japanese servicemen to surrender were unsuccessful due to a language barrier, the message was more effective after changing the language on the leaflets from "I surrender" to "I cease resistance," which allowed them to capitalize upon the concept of saving face. The message being delivered should best suit the target audience, not the messenger's tastes. Miscalculation in this area could lead to catastrophic effects, unintentionally. Psychologists and sociologists working together on research during the Second World War would prove to be an important part in the development of modern psychology, a development which turned the interests of researchers after the war toward a variety of social problems, including issues of gender and racial prejudice. Much like social psychology, the study of psychological warfare would develop in the years after the war, as tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States began to escalate. The Cold War was not primarily a military conflict, but rather a global struggle of ideologies. In this war of words, orchestrated mass media campaigns and covert psychological operations were among the weapons of choice. In the early 1950s, President Dwight D. Eisenhower founded agencies and a large network of think tanks and research institutions, which were tasked with developing psychological warfare methods to compete against the Soviet Union. As the Cold War developed, the KGB and other Soviet intelligence agencies began analyzing the current state of psychological warfare in the United States. Their reports on U.S. foreign propaganda also included an in-depth analysis of how strategic psychological considerations even shaped the process of policymaking in the United States. Although it was determined that Western propaganda and communist propaganda were not seen as having anything in common. Both American and Soviet researchers each accused the opposition of the use of half-truths and pure fabrications as the defining characteristic in their propaganda methods.
In July 1978, on a day the paper had not planned to publish, a bizarre edition of the weekly was put into circulation with articles and semi-nude photos designed to offend its conservative and older readership.
Our readers are mostly middle-aged people who would never dream of doing anything like that, you know. The letter, supposedly written by a Jewish writer, referring to our journalist, a contributor to the paper, Mr. Hanf, as a war criminal, Nazi war criminal. The funny part of it is that when the war ended, he was about 18 years old, you know.
Ladislav Bittman was deputy director when he was with Czech intelligence.
This information can have a variety of forms. It's basically an information deliberately misleading that is leaked to deceive the decision makers in the United States or Germany or Britain, or it can be a disinformation to deceive the public opinion.
You got to be fairly good at this when you were with Czech intelligence, didn't you?
Unfortunately, I have to admit, yes.
In both countries, the Cold War as a global ideological conflict was an important kickstarter for exploring the functions and effects of mass media and propaganda in modern society.
They have attempted to make it appear that they are winning a military victory. Their target is American public opinion, and this is the only way they can conceivably win this war.
Kantian, then, you're saying, is not really a military action, but a political or psychological warfare action.
Precisely.
Although psychological warfare was practiced to a greater degree in the Vietnam conflict than in any other war in history, very little has been published about the operations. Among the operations that took place was a propaganda campaign named Operation Wandering Soul. Like most cultures, Vietnamese culture includes beliefs and rituals that show respect for the dead. One of the most interesting superstitions of Vietnam is the belief in the wandering soul. It is the Vietnamese belief that the dead must be buried in their homeland, or their soul will wander aimlessly in pain and suffering. In an attempt to increase desertion and defections from the Viet Cong forces and weaken their morale, U.S. engineers spent weeks recording eerie sounds and altered voices, which act like rolls of slain Viet Cong soldiers. The tape, code-named Ghost Tape 10, was amplified through loudspeakers in areas of Viet Cong activity in the dead of the night. The success of Ghost Tape 10 was mixed because the Viet Cong soldiers knew it was merely a recording, but the ethics of this operation, and similar ones, have certainly been called into question.
The voice of the United Nations carries on where bullets and shell fire cease, bringing hope to many for the first time.
Propaganda and psychological warfare operations would continue to develop in the 20th century using similar techniques during the Gulf War in the early 90s. But if you're still with me at this point, I wanted to switch gears and take a look at how psychological warfare has impacted the world in more recent years. In the midst of the cyber age, the global system, and of course, psychological warfare, has changed dramatically in the years after 9/11. The development of the internet and social media has enabled the use of Psy-ops and disinformation on a mass scale. Analysts have found evidence of doctored or misleading photographs spread through social media platforms during conflicts like the Syrian civil war and currently. One of the most notable examples of war propaganda was the Ghost of Kiev, which came shortly after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, when unconfirmed rumors of a mythical fighter pilot spread like wildfire across social media, crediting the pilot with gunning down 6 enemy aircraft within the first hours of the war. The story was observed to be a major morale boost for the Ukrainian population. Internet memes are one of the latest evolutions of leaflet propaganda and an effective tool in the arsenal of digital persuasion. Communication experts have observed that memes can be used to target specific groups in order to build and solidify tribal bonds, and have been found to be very effective in doing so. The ease of which memes can be created and disseminated by anyone with access to the internet opens doors to previously unfounded participation with regard to societal and political issues. Similar to their precursor, Internet memes' success and failures are highly dependent upon cultural and linguistic understanding of the target audience. The evolution of psychological warfare and propaganda can tell us a lot about history and the general feeling of a society at a particular time. Edward Bernays and other psychological experts' methods of persuasion are just as powerful as when they were first discovered, and will become more difficult to point out as technology develops at a rapid pace. There's much more to cover about this topic, but because it's so vast, I'll have to put that in a different video. But I hope you enjoyed this research. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic. Remember to like, subscribe, and watch one of these videos that pop up on your screen. My name is Inhuman Form, and I'll see you on the next one.